Nilsson, or Sita. In addition to talking about your background, please comment on the gaps between legislating women's rights and implementing them, and also on the relationship between culture or tradition and women's rights.
Okay, thank you very much, Cindy, and thank you all for being here this afternoon, and thank you to Womenetics for organizing this terrific event. I come to this panel as an academic. That is the sector I represent. I have a PhD in political science and African studies from Northwestern University, and I don't know if I'll tell you what year it was, but you'll probably figure that out eventually. It was during my graduate work that I became very interested in the subject of women in politics, and I have been doing work on women in politics in sub-Saharan Africa for about the last 20 years. As I have been doing this work, I should say that I felt fairly early on, pretty constrained by working within the disciplinary boundaries of political science. We've been talking a lot today about boundaries and silos and how to cross those. So my first move was to go to the emerging interdisciplinary field of international studies, thinking that you're within the university, but you're really taking a number of disciplines into account as you try to understand what's happening in the world. My latest adventure is as director of the Institute for Developing Nations at Emory University. That is a partnership with the Carter Center. And it has taken us, we embrace doing interdisciplinary research on development issues, but we also embrace the notion of partnership and the idea that solutions to poverty, to social injustice, to human insecurity are going to come from multiple sectors working together. So as we work on defining research agendas and research problems, we are always talking to NGOs, we're talking to policymakers, we're talking to, most importantly, I think, people who are in the countries in which the research is kind of focusing, and partnering with them as we do our work. Cindy has asked me to talk in a kind of general reflective way about a couple issues about women and human rights that I guess come up from a reflection of the work I've done. The first thing I'd like to talk about is legal frameworks, because we put a lot of faith, I think, in legal frameworks when we're talking about women's status and women's human rights. But I'd like to just suggest a couple of the gaps that are out there that we also need to pay attention to if we're going to work towards that goal of women's rights being human rights. The first kind of gap that I want to talk about involves the gap between having the law on the books and implementing that law. I first saw this gap when I was in Zimbabwe in the late 1980s. There, I've dated myself now, my dissertation research. And I was looking at rural women's involvement in the liberation struggle in Zimbabwe. And I went to Zimbabwe in part because when they became independent in 1980, after a decade-long liberation struggle, there was all of this progressive legislation to improve the status of women that was passed. Most importantly, there was the Legal Age of Majority Act, which gave women the kind of status of legal majors at the age of 18. But there was also laws about giving women access to property, guaranteeing child support for women, you know, whether they were married or not, to the fathers of their children, and making discrimination in the workplace illegal. So I thought, this must be a wonderful place for women to be, and I've got to go check it out. Of course, when I got there, I found out that the situation was much more complicated on the ground than it was from just looking at the legal framework. One of the ways in which it was complicated is that the real cornerstone of kind of improving women's status was this Legal Age of Majority Act. But there was actually a lot of resistance to that act on the ground from men, from senior women. They didn't like the idea that women could be legally independent at the age of 18, because it meant that they wouldn't necessarily have to participate in negotiations about bride price. And that undercut the authority of men and senior women. And so there were a lot of people who didn't like the idea of the Legal Age of Majority Act. There were also laws mandating that men pay child support to women, and these laws sounded very good. But women would tell stories of trying to bring these child support cases to the courts, only to be met with court clerks who would demand sex in order to get their case on the dockets. And if they didn't kind of meet that barrier, when they finally got the cases into the court, the judge would typically award a fraction of the amount of money in which they were owed. So you can see that in terms of implementing the law, there was a gap. And I think that politically, what was going on in terms of how the state was beginning to shift at the time, and I'm sure you all know kind of what's happened in Zimbabwe in the intervening 20 years. But already at this time, in the early 1980s, while this progressive legislation was being passed, the government was conducting roundups of women who they said they were rounding up vagrants and prostitutes. But in fact, women's organizations in Zimbabwe who collected the testimonies of women who were rounded up, arrested, some of them shipped to the Zambezi Valley for education, said, in fact, these were independent women. There were women who held jobs as secretaries, teachers, nurses. They lived on their own. They may have been, when the roundups were happening, moving around the downtown area on their own. They were, in effect, women who were not under the obvious control of a man. And so the state was kind of sending this message as well, why this progressive legislation is going on. These raids happened in 1983. They happened in 1985. They happened in 1987, usually before some big international event. So you're getting a very, very double message and have to look way beyond the law to see whether women's status has really, in fact, improved. The second kind of gap that I want to talk about is a gap in state capacity. And to talk about this gap, I'm going to tell a little story here. And the story comes from Liberia. You hopefully all know that Liberia's president, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, the first woman president in Africa, shortly after she took power, the legislature passed what has become known as the rape law. This rape law criminalized rape both inside and outside of marriage, so it recognized that rape could happen within the confines of marriage, and it made the penalties for rape much more harsh than they had been before. The reality on the ground in Liberia, however, is that outside of the capital city of Monrovia, access to the legal system, the security system, and the health system is extremely limited. In a recent study that was just put out by the United States Institute for Peace, looking at efforts to build rule of law in Liberia, they pointed out this problem, and this anecdote comes from that study, so if you'll bear with me, I found it very moving and I want to share it with you. The daughter of an 83-year-old rape victim wanted to bring the perpetrator to justice in the formal system. After filing the case in the magistrate court, the daughter was outraged at the fees she was made to pay for court registration and multiple medical exams. She was told to bring her mother to the circuit court, located many hours away, which she did, and they waited for days until they were told that the term had ended and she would need to return when the next term began. She tried to do so, but it was rainy season and she had no means of transportation. She carried her mother in a wheelbarrow until it was clear that her mother's health was failing and that she needed to return home. When the daughter returned to the circuit court, she was told that the case could not be heard in the absence of the victim. And by the time she returned home, her mother had passed away. Sadly, there are too many stories of this similar vein that can be told that illustrate the great limitations on state capacity to implement the law. A lot of times in looking at issues of women and human rights, the assumption is that tradition equals bad for women, right? Culture and tradition are somehow pre-modern and against progress, and so cultural institutions need to be overcome or done away with or things like that. I just wanted to give a kind of cautionary note about that, because I think it's one needs a much more nuanced approach to questions of culture and tradition. You know, women may invoke tradition and support for tradition, but it may in fact be not about traditions that support violence against women in this case, but about traditions that support the importance of women's senior status in a society that has been undercut by whatever processes. And there are also ways in which women can utilize so-called traditional institutions to work towards their own empowerment and towards change in their own societies. So this was just a cautionary story about don't make assumptions about tradition.